Today, we're stepping into the quiet town of Columbia, Illinois, where a man entrusted with protecting others became the architect of unimaginable loss. This is the story of Christopher Coleman, a father, a husband, and a bodyguard to a world-famous televangelist, who murdered his wife and two young sons in their sleep. Christopher Coleman was born on March 20th, 1977, in the United States into a devout Christian household. His parents, Ron and Connie Coleman, were both pastors, and their faith shaped the moral framework of their family life. Raised in a religious environment, Chris was expected to uphold values of integrity, devotion, and service. Principles that would later be weaponized in one of the most shocking betrayals in recent American true crime history. Coleman's early years were marked by discipline and structure. His father, Ron Coleman, was known for his strong pastoral leadership, and the family's religious convictions were not just personal, they were public. Chris grew up in a community where reputation mattered, and where deviation from moral expectations was not easily forgiven. After graduating high school, Coleman enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. His military service added another layer of discipline and control to his persona. It also gave him access to a network of influence that would later connect him to Joyce Meyer Ministries, a global evangelical organization headquartered in Missouri. Following his time in the Marines, Coleman was hired as a personal security guard for Joyce Meyer, a prominent televangelist and president of Joyce Meyer Ministries. This role placed him in close proximity to one of the most influential figures in American evangelical circles. It also came with prestige and financial stability. Coleman reportedly earned around $100,000 annually. His job required frequent travel, discretion, and unwavering loyalty. He was tasked with protecting Meyer during public appearances and private engagements, and his position was seen as both honorable and high risk. Within the ministry, Coleman was regarded as a trusted figure, someone who embodied the values of the organization. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Sheri Weiss was born in 1978 and raised in a similarly faith-centered environment. She was known for her warmth, empathy, and devotion to her family. Friends described her as someone who lit up a room, who loved fiercely, and who always put her children first. She was close with her parents and maintained strong ties to her childhood friends, including Tara Lintz, who would later become her husband's mistress. Christopher Coleman and Sheri Weiss first encountered paths in May 1997 at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. At the time, Coleman was a 22-year-old Marine serving as a K-9 handler, and Sheri was a 21-year-old military police officer in the U.S. Air Force. The connection between them was immediate. Despite coming from different branches of the military, they bonded over shared values and a mutual sense of purpose. Their relationship progressed quickly. Within the first few months, Sheri was pregnant with their first child, Garett. The couple married soon after during a weekend trip to Chicago, and their second son, Gavin, was born about 2 years later. Their early years together were marked by optimism and devotion. Friends and neighbors later described them as a loving couple, and their family was, quote, beautiful and close-knit. Sheri's life was centered around her role as a mother and a wife. She was actively involved in her sons' lives, attending school events, organizing family outings, and creating a home filled with love and faith. Her relationship with Chris, though increasingly strained, was one she fought to preserve. She believed in marriage, in forgiveness, and in the power of prayer, but she also sensed something was wrong. Christopher Coleman began his affair with Tara Lintz in November 2008, just 6 months before the murder of his wife, Sheri, and their two sons. Tara wasn't a stranger. She was Sheri's childhood friend, someone who had known the Coleman family for years. Coleman met Lintz while traveling for work with the Joyce Meyer Ministries. Lintz, a cocktail waitress living in St. Petersburg, Florida, reconnected with Coleman during one of his trips. Their relationship escalated quickly. Within weeks, they were exchanging sexually explicit messages, photos, and videos. One of the most damning pieces of evidence presented at trial was a sex tape they filmed together in Hawaii while Coleman was on a ministry trip. Coleman documented the affair obsessively. Investigators found a Word document on his personal computer titled, quote, 11/5/08, the day Tara changed my life. The file included intimate details about Lentz, her ring size, body measurements, sexual preferences, and even a name they had chosen for their future child, Zoe Lynn Coleman. Lentz testified in court that she and Coleman had exchanged promise rings. She wore hers during the testimony, underscoring the seriousness of their relationship. They had discussed marriage and were actively looking for a time to wed, specifically when Joyce Meyer's schedule would allow Coleman to take time off. Lentz believed Coleman was preparing to divorce Sheri and start a new life with her. In fact, Coleman told Lentz he planned to serve Sheri with divorce papers on May 5, 2009, the very day Sheri, Garett, and Gavin were found murdered in their beds. Coleman's affair wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was part of a broader pattern of manipulation and control. He feared that divorcing Sheri would cost him his $100,000 a year job at Joyce Meyer Ministries, which had strict moral guidelines. Rather than risk his career and reputation, Coleman chose to eliminate his family. Perhaps one of the most disturbing details revealed during the investigation was that Coleman continued to text Lentz during Sheri's funeral. According to search warrants, he sent her messages expressing love and longing while standing at the service for the wife and children he'd just murdered. This behavior highlighted his emotional detachment and the depth of his deception. On the morning of May 5, 2009, the quiet suburb of Columbia, Illinois, woke to a tragedy that would shake its foundations. Inside a modest two-story home on Winchester Drive, 3 lives had been extinguished. 31-year-old Sheri Coleman and her sons 11-year-old Garett and 9-year-old Gavin. The man who reported concern for their safety was Christopher Coleman, Sheri's husband and the boys' father. But as investigators would soon uncover, he was not a grieving survivor, he was the killer. Christopher Coleman left his home around 5:43 a.m. to go to the gym, a routine he followed religiously. He texted Sheri from the gym but received no response. At 6:53 a.m., he called his neighbor and friend, Detective Justin Barlow, expressing concern that Sheri wasn't answering her phone. Barlow, a Columbia police officer, lived just 2 doors down and had previously installed surveillance cameras on the Coleman home due to threatening emails the family had received. Barlow entered the house through an unlocked window and discovered a scene of horror. Sheri was found strangled in her bed. Garett and Gavin were also found in their respective bedrooms, each strangled with a ligature. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, and no evidence of a struggle. The murders had occurred while the victims slept. In the months leading up to the murders, Coleman had reported receiving threatening emails from an anonymous sender. The messages, sent to his personal and work accounts, warned that his family was in danger and demanded that Joyce Meyer stop preaching. One message read, quote, "I'm going to kill them all as they sleep." Coleman claimed the threats were from a disgruntled follower of Joyce Meyer Ministries, where he worked as head of security. The ministry took the threat seriously, and police installed surveillance equipment on the Coleman home. But the murder investigation quickly revealed that the emails had been sent from Coleman's own laptop, using a Gmail account created on his work computer. Digital forensics traced the IP address of the threatening email to Coleman's homes and workplace. The timestamps matched periods when Coleman was known to be alone. Investigators concluded that the threats were part of a staged narrative designed to deflect suspicion and create the illusion of an external threat. Back to the scene, Sheri was found lying on her stomach in bed, with signs of ligature strangulation. Her face showed petechial hemorrhaging, which is tiny blood spots caused by asphyxiation. Garett and Gavin were found in similar positions, each in their own bed, with no signs of resistance. The medical examiner determined that all 3 victims died between 3 and 5 a.m., before Coleman even left the house. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen. The house was undisturbed except for the bodies. Investigators found red spray-painted messages on the wall, included, quote, punished and, quote, I am watching. These were meant to reinforce the illusion of a stalker, but the handwriting and paint matched materials found in Coleman's possession. Coleman's gym visit was also scrutinized. Surveillance footage showed him arriving at the gym and interacting with staff, but his demeanor was calm and composed. He made no mention of concern for his family until after he returned home and contacted Barlow. Detectives quickly focused on Coleman, and his affair with Tara Lintz was discovered. Coleman's motive became clear. He wanted to start a new life with Lintz, but feared that divorce would cost him his job at Joyce Meyer Ministries. The ministry had strict moral guidelines, and a divorce, especially one involving infidelity, could lead to termination. Rather than face the consequences, Coleman chose the murder. The digital trail was damning. Investigators recovered the Gmail account used to send threats created on Coleman's work laptop, a timeline of email activity that matched Coleman's known whereabouts, deleted messages and browser history showing searches for strangulation and crime scene staging, surveillance footage showing Coleman's calm demeanor at the gym, and the text messages to Lintz during Sheri's funeral expressing his love and longing. The forensic timeline placed the murders between 3 and 5 a.m., and Coleman left for the gym at 5:43 a.m., giving him a narrow window to commit the crimes. The lack of forced entry in the staged threats pointed to an inside job as well. Christopher Coleman was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was packed. Family members, journalists, and community members all gathered to witness the proceedings. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Christina Kuntz, presented a case built on digital forensic, physical evidence, and motive. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Coleman had no time to commit the murders, but the jury was about to hear a story that left little room for doubt. I'm now going to revisit the key evidence that was presented in court. Digital forensics experts testified that the threatening emails were sent from the Gmail account created on Coleman's work laptop. The account was accessed from Coleman's home and office. The timestamps matched his schedule. The emails were filled with threats, including, quote, I'm going to kill them all as they sleep. This evidence established premeditation and deception. Coleman had created a fictional stalker to justify future violence. Crime scene photos showed red spray-painted messages on the walls of the Coleman home. The phrases, quote, punished and, quote, I am watching, were meant to suggest an outside threat. But investigators found paint cans in Coleman's possession that matched the color and composition. The handwriting was also consistent with Coleman's own. This detail reinforced the theory that the crime scene had been staged. Tara Lintz testified that she and Coleman had exchanged promise rings and planned to marry. She even wore her ring during her own testimony. As stated earlier, they had filmed a sex tape in Hawaii while Coleman was supposed to be traveling with Joyce Meyer Ministries. Coleman had promised to serve Sheri with divorce papers on May 5, 2009, the day of the murders. Lintz's testimony provided a motive. That Coleman wanted a new life, but feared that divorce would cost him his job and also his reputation. Murder, for some reason he believed, was the only way out. The document titled 110508, The Day Chara Changed My Life, was also read aloud in court. It included intimate details about Lintz and the plans for their future together. Prosecutors argued that the document showed intent and emotional investment in a life beyond Sheri and the children. Coleman's texts to Lintz during Sheri's funeral were also presented as evidence of emotional detachment. He expressed love and longing while standing at the service. This behavior was described by prosecutors as, quote, chilling and, quote, sociopathic. While Coleman did not undergo a formal psychiatric evaluation during the trial, his behavior was analyzed by investigators and prosecutors. His ability to stage the crime scene, fabricate threats, and maintain a calm demeanor suggested a high level of manipulation and emotional detachment. Prosecutors argued that Coleman exhibited traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial behavior. His actions were calculated, his emotions performative, and his concern centered on self-preservation. Sheri's family testified about her character, her devotion to her children, and her growing concern about Coleman's behavior. Friends described Sheri as warm, empathetic, and deeply committed to her marriage. She had confided in others about the threatening emails and her fear for her family's safety. She was deeply unsettled by the threatening emails Coleman claimed were sent by a stalker, especially one that was placed in their mailbox while he was away in Hawaii. Sheri reportedly believed the threats were real and was frightened for her children's safety. While she may not have known definitively about the affair, her growing anxiety and sense of betrayal were palpable. Friends testified that Sheri had begun to question Coleman's behavior, and her trust in him was eroding. The community of Columbia, Illinois was shaken. Coleman had been seen as a protector, a man of faith, and a devoted father. The revelation of his affair, deception, and violence shattered that image. After 15 hours of deliberation, the jury found Christopher Coleman guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Following the conviction of Christopher Coleman for the murder of his wife Sheri and their 2 sons, the presiding judge delivered a stark and emotionally charged statement that underscored the gravity of the crime and its devastating impact. Quote, "This was not just a betrayal of a family, it was a betrayal of every sacred duty a husband and a father holds. You extinguished 3 lives to preserve your own image, your own desires. The court finds no justification, no redemption in your actions." End quote. The judge emphasized that Coleman's motive, protecting his affair and career, was, quote, "as selfish as it was chilling." He described the murders as, quote, "premeditated, calculated, and cowardly," noting that Coleman had staged threatening emails to create a false narrative of danger, all while planning the killings. Quote, "You were not the protector of your family. You were the executioner." End quote. The sentencing closed with a moment of silence in the courtroom, honoring Sheri, Garett, and Gavin. The judge's word echoed the prosecution's framing of Coleman as a man who weaponized manipulation and deceit to escape accountability. Coleman did appeal the verdict, but in 2015, the appellate court upheld the sentence, citing, quote, "overwhelming evidence." After Christopher Coleman was arrested and charged with the murders of his wife Sheri and their sons, his parents, Ron and Connie Coleman, remained staunchly supportive of him. But what shocked many observers was not just their loyalty, it was their willingness to publicly criticize Sheri, even after her death. In interviews and court-adjacent commentary, Ron and Connie Coleman suggested that Sheri had contributed to the deterioration of their marriage. According to reporting by St. Louis magazine, they implied that Sheri was not the ideal wife and that she had changed over time, becoming distant and difficult. These comments were made despite overwhelming evidence that Christopher had been engaging in a long-time affair, had staged threatening emails, and had ultimately murdered his family in cold blood. Rather than expressing grief or solidarity with Sheri's family, the Colemans focused on defending their son's character. They portrayed him as a victim of circumstance, someone who'd been pushed to the edge. Seriously, I rolled my eyes when I heard this. This narrative stood in stark contrast to the prosecution's case, which painted Christopher as a calculating, self-serving individual who murdered his family to protect his image and career. Sheri's families and friends were deeply hurt by the Colemans' comments. To them, Sheri had been a loving mother, a devoted wife, and someone who had tried to hold her family together despite growing fears and emotional abuse. The fact that her in-laws tried to malign her character, rather than honor her memory, was seen as a continuation of the control and erasure she had experienced during her marriage. This dynamic also highlighted a broader issue in domestic violence cases: the tendency of some family members to protect the perpetrator at the expense of the victim. By blaming Sheri, the Colemans not only deflected attention from their son's actions, but also contributed to a narrative that undermined accountability and justice. While Ron and Connie Coleman were not called to testify during the trial, their public statements became part of a broader conversation about the case. Sheri's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Joyce Meyer Ministries, arguing that the organization had failed to act on warning signs and had a duty of care to Sheri and her children. The lawsuit was partially upheld by the appellate court, which agreed that the ministry's electronic communications policy warranted further scrutiny. The Colemans' defense of their son and their criticism of Sheri did not sway the jury anyways. Christopher Coleman was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But the emotional damage caused by his parents' comments lingered, especially for those who had loved Sheri and her boys. Since his 2011 conviction for the murder of his wife Sheri and their sons Garett and Gavin, Christopher Coleman has been serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole at Walpen Correctional Institution at Walpen, Wisconsin. Coleman, now in his late 40s, lives under strict supervision and routine. As a convicted triple murderer, he is classified as a high-risk inmate, and his movements, communications, and privileges are tightly controlled. After Coleman's sentencing, there's no indication that Lentz maintained any contact with him. The relationship appears to have ended abruptly, despite her wearing her promise ring, likely due to the horrific nature of the crimes and the public fallout. Post-trial, Lentz retreated from public view. She did not make any further public statements, and there's no record of her engaging with media or continuing any association with Coleman. Given the emotional toll and the scrutiny she faced, both being a key witness and a figure tied to the motive, her withdrawal seems to reflect a desire to distance herself from the case entirely. Sheri Coleman was a mother who loved deeply, a woman who believed in grace, and someone who tried to hold her family together even as it was quietly unraveling. Garett and Gavin were bright, joyful boys, full of curiosity, laughter, and the kind of light that only children carry. They deserved a future, they deserved safety, and they deserved to grow up. This story is not just about betrayal, it's about remembrance. It's about the lives that were lost and the love that remains. Sheri's family and friends remember her smile, her warmth, and her fierce devotion to her children. Her boys are remembered in classrooms, in playgrounds, and in the hearts of those who knew them, and today we remember them here. Thank you for listening.